That's great. Thank you. A cybersecurity use case describes a relevant scenario of compromise and potential methods of detecting this offensive activity. And my intention here is to walk you through my thoughts on developing cybersecurity use cases. I want to mention that use cases are distinguished from hunting. Hunting is intended to be adaptive, ad hoc, not especially engineered. You can produce operational and scripts and other assets in order to help with hunting. But the hunting itself is more about identifying suspicious items and looking and investigating them. But the hunting can actually produce ideas to build use cases. And the use case is intended to be something that is the implementation of that in an engineered fashion. And I don't want my hunting to be impeded with all sorts of engineering requirements. I want my hunting to be fast, efficient, responsive, and during the hunting, I might have some ideas about something that we could engineer later, but I'm not going to try to engineer that while I'm hunting. The use case should be engineered for effective performance from the very beginning. The appropriate use cases selected as things worthy of investment of time and effort. And eventually, you may realize that some of the use cases that you thought were relevant and important aren't. And that's okay. You can expire some of them over time. The use case should not be generating a lot of extra work for the analyst to try to determine what they actually need to do. So here's how I suggest that you build the use case. You start with a scenario of interest and its business relevance. And if there is no business relevance, then don't proceed with building it into a use case. You can still hunt for stuff that doesn't necessarily have business relevance in order to make sure that you've covered everything. But I wouldn't exert the sort of effort that I'm advocating for use case for things that the business doesn't care that much about. So you need to understand what your business actually does care about. These include things like legal drivers and industry requirements. These include the desire to protect your organization's reputation and to protect the data that your organization is entrusted with. And both the security team and the organization itself might need to realign their thoughts in terms of what they're doing when they're starting to consider this business relevance. The characteristics of the scenario should be broken down into small pieces so that what you're developing is actually a sequence, a storyline. And if you have a couple of variations within the storyline, that's fine. But if you have something where this is a twisted, forking story that has all sorts of plot twists and changes, it probably actually needs to be separated into multiple different use cases. We want to have a reasonable story to develop our use case on. And part of this is breaking it down into the sequence of actions whereby an adversary might do something to our organization that our organization really doesn't want to have happen. And if you find that you're dealing with a scenario with lots of different variations and permutations, split it out. Develop separate use cases. They may be redundant in parts, but those big variations are appropriate to have this sort of treatment for. And so I want to have all of the possible stages of the sequence that I'm investigating. And then once I've done that, I have an opportunity to identify what artifacts are available in my information systems that potentially contain data relevant to the scenario of interest. And this might be all of the different log entries that I can cherry pick from to help me to understand whether this scenario is happening or not. There also might be other systems that we don't necessarily start with or even consider initially, but that might be good enhancement data. if we're thinking about an individual and questioning if that individual is doing something inside of a computer network, we probably have an adjacent system that we could look at to see if that person's actually physically present in a given location. So these sorts of things, if you're approaching it from a storyline and build out, the artifacts start to become more apparent in terms of what's there. And then part of what I want to do as I'm developing this scenario and identifying artifacts is, on a per artifact basis, I want to consider what are some of my detection opportunities within that data. How would a system or an analyst determine that this characteristic is bad and this characteristic is good? And I want to actually articulate this. And I probably need to do a bunch of work at this phase in terms of hypothesizing and testing and sampling the data and seeing if I can differentiate things. And I want to actually provide to the analyst information about this is probably good and this is probably bad, and here's your guidance for this. And if at all possible, I want the information system, the SOC system, wherever we implement this particular use case, I want that to do that differentiation, but it doesn't have to do the differentiation. I can, at some point in this effort, actually defer to the analyst for judgment. And if I'm doing that, I want to have some attributes of the data, which are detection opportunities for the analyst to consider. And if I'm engineering use cases, then this is something that I've thought through. In addition to me looking at the data and looking for detection opportunities, I want to look at the data and look for enrichment opportunities. The enrichment might be threat intelligence. It might be correlation information based on internal assets. It might be data related to the reputation of the system which is being communicated with, its age, the number of times that we've encountered that previously, our knowledge about the reputation of that. So if it's a specific domain that we know is one of our vendor partners, it tends to be considered less likely to be malicious. It might have turned into something malicious, but that reputation has weight, and we can enrich the information that we have as part of our use case with this sort of reputational data. The domains in question may be newly created. They may be old, venerable domains that are in the Alexa Top 500. All of this is enrichment. We can look at the utilization of our system that we're investigating and see, is this normal for this particular system? If I go back and look at the history of the system and an attribute that I'm attempting to enrich, is this actually normal for browser frequency of connections, for the specific user agent in the browser? I can look at the particular system's own history that I've collected. I can also use that particular system and compare it via a category of systems and see if it's an outlier based on various attributes of the data that I'm investigating. And this enrichment becomes an opportunity for me to, again, make a differentiation about whether this is okay or not. The implementation of the use case will usually happen in a SIEM, whatever you want to call it, but it doesn't actually have to happen in a SIEM. Okay, there might be some other system that we have available that is a much better place to implement this. We should develop unit testing. This is a good circumstance that we want things to not be triggered on. And here is an evil circumstance where we want this use case to trigger and alert. And these unit tests should be developed as part of the use case development and part of the implementation plan. And when I implement this into the production SIEM, I should have a unit test that I can actually put in place and run it on one of the monitored systems and show that this thing triggers when it's supposed to, and show that it doesn't trigger when it's not supposed to. And I should have guidance for the analyst in terms of where there might be some margin of error in terms of the engineering that's there. And then after I've implemented this, I want to do assessment of the performance of it. I want to reuse those unit tests, especially at first. I want to reuse those unit tests frequently, but I can use them over time in order to assess the performance of this thing. Is this still on? Is it still picking up? If I run the same test that I ran 3 months ago when I first implemented that, does the data get to the same place in the same way that I would expect it to work exactly as when I engineered it initially? I want to look at the use cases that I've implemented and look at their performance over time after they start encountering data. I want to have circumstances where I have lots of true positives and very few false positives. And if I have very few true positives and very many false positives, then I need to review and refine and adjust that particular mechanism. And that means that I'll probably need to take it back to the scenario case, look at the characteristics of that scenario, look at the artifacts, look at the detection opportunities, see where this is failing, work on enrichment, work on adjusting that particular use case. And I have some frequency where I do this on my systems. I have some frequency where I'm actually expiring use cases that aren't relevant any longer. I'm looking for circumstances where I have an opportunity for improvement. And my analysts should have the assurance that when they identify use cases which are problematic for them, that we have a mechanism in order to be able to actually revise and review them. In addition to that, on a monthly or quarterly basis, your team, who is responsible for the operations and maintenance of your security information systems, should be looking and analyzing these use cases just for performance. This will change over time. This will change over time. There need to be some way that you are committed to a frequent review. Whatever that frequency is, you need to determine what resources you have for that, and you need to determine your tolerance for that. So you want to expire the ones that are no longer relevant at all. You want to enhance the ones that are having problems, and you want to keep the ones in place that are actually working. So my idea for the sequence that you use in order to build a use case, you identify the scenario of interest and business relevance. You extract the characteristics of that scenario by decomposing it into steps. You identify the artifacts of data. You look for detection opportunities and enrichment opportunities within that data. You then implement that and have a program of monitoring, assessment, review, revision, and expiration. So, as I said, my opinion is that a cybersecurity use case describes a relevant scenario of compromise and the potential methods of detecting this offensive activity. And if you have a revision that you'd propose to this definition, if you have criticism of it, if you agree with it, please go ahead and tweet it and let me know. And that's a really good opportunity for us to facilitate that discussion. If you've thought a lot about the definition of what a cybersecurity use case is, good for you. If you have a sequence of development that you can follow in order to build them consistently for your organization, good for you. So I want to turn things over now to Vulcan. I've shared my opinion about how one should build a use case, and I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about how you with Picus are actually implementing your definition of a use case and what your process and program is for effectively implementing that.